Morning, everybody. We're letting everybody
Morning.
in. We don't have Mike in person today, but he's with us. But I don't have his help with the he always helps me with the room, with the tech room, but he's here online. So that's good.
I'm here online.
Yeah. Um so I hope everyone's doing okay this morning. And today we're making our journey through the prophets. Today we're actually going to skip 150 years beyond where we were, or move. We're going to time travel 150 years over the course of the two prophets that we're going to read today. So it's pretty cool. We're online, we're on Facebook, last week we had a couple technical difficulties because of the way we set up for our speakers on Tuesday, but so Wednesday night we were a little messed up, and gosh, it's hard to believe that was last week, because a whole lot of stuff has happened since then in the world. So it's been a long week, just a long weekend. But it's great to have everybody here. And in the lead up to Passover, it's actually, we're almost getting to the prophet that we actually read this weekend. We were so close. I mean, if we had been maybe 3 or 4 weeks earlier, we would have actually gotten to the prophet that we read this Shabbat. So we were really close, but I'm going to show it to you anyways, even though we're not going to skip out of order. I was thinking about skipping out of order, and then I said, you know what? We don't do that. But we will take a look at the prophets today. Actually, we'll show you. I'll show you as I let people in and get everybody here together. We don't have a lot of people here in person. We have Mary here. Judith just asked, who's here in person? Mary's here in person. Judith looked at the list of people and said, who's left? Everyone's online. But Mary's here. Mary's holding down the fort. Do you hear her, Judith? Can you hear her?
I can. Hi, Mary.
So she's
Hello,
here
Mary.
You're representing everybody.
Hello, Mary.
Hello, Mary.
There you go. So, but I'm going to show everybody this is where we are right now at the prophets. So the books, the prophets begin with the historical prophets that we began a long time ago. When we began this whole Beyond the Torah study, we started with Joshua, and then we went through to the kings, the historical prophets, and then we read the big three, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, which all took a few months. And then we started with, again, what we call the minor prophets, the 12 prophets that are much shorter. They add up, all 12 of them add up to less than Isaiah. But we went through Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, and Habakkuk last week. And then this week, we're going to be reading these two guys, Zephaniah and Haggai, and possibly even starting Zechariah. But what's interesting is this guy that we're reading first, Zephaniah, he is from the period before the temple is destroyed, right before the temple is destroyed. So he lives at the time of some of the people that we already read, like, the most famous, of course, was Jeremiah. So he kind of overlaps with Jeremiah, and I'm going to show you in a second. But then these last guys, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they're all prophets working after the temple is already destroyed and for the people that are going to return and have started to return. So these three guys are working at a different time. And let me just show you on the chart, the historical chart, what we're talking about. So the guy that we're reading today, first, Zephaniah, he lives during the time of Habakkuk that we just read. Nahum, who we just read, who works in the north, a little bit earlier, but these are all people working during the time before the temple was destroyed and people were taken into captivity. But the guys right afterwards, who are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, and of course Jeremiah, who we read about, who writes as the temple is being destroyed, before the temple is being destroyed here, and then after the temple is also, he's still writing. He's over that period. But these three guys that we finished the books, the prophetic books, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they're all writing after the temple has already been destroyed for the generation that's coming back. So that's why I said we're actually going to be skipping over. We're going from one period to the next. So again, this first guy, Zephaniah, he writes during the time of Josiah, and we'll see his introduction in a second. So here we got somebody else. We got Jesse. So Mary's been joined by Jesse. So there's now a couple people here, but so we're going to be reading a prophet from before the temple was destroyed, not long before, but before, and then these prophets after. And as I showed you, when we look at the books, the prophetic books, these are the guys that we read at the end, and they're chronologically placed there, and then they help us understand again what it was like for the people who lived during the Second Temple period, and some of the changes that went around during that time, not least of which is that there aren't many prophets. The guy we're reading today, though, Haggai, is actually mentioned in another part of the Bible. What's interesting is that we actually have, in the next section of the Bible we're going to get to, the book of writings, which will be starting in a little bit, about a month, we actually have historical books that cover this period. They're Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicle, and the books of Chronicles. But Chronicles really are a repetition in some ways, though they have some extra information and they're also missing some information. They're really a repetition of the books of Kings. But Ezra and Nehemiah, on the other hand, are not. They're historical books that talk about what it was like for the Jews when they came back. And what's interesting is that in chapter 5 of Ezra, he actually mentions Haggai and Zechariah. So we don't have a lot of places in the Bible where prophets are mentioned by name, but these guys are. And again, these are prophets who worked during the time of Ezra and who are mentioned in the historical account of Ezra and Nehemiah doesn't mention them, but Ezra and Nehemiah were the people who led the Jews when they came back from Babylon. So it's a really interesting thing to think about these guys. I'll show you again the last chapter of the prophets, the last chapter of Malachi. Actually, let me show you one other thing. Every year at Passover time, right? We come to a special time of year, right? This Shabbat that we're about to enter is called, what's it called, this Shabbat? Somebody tell me. Anybody? This Shabbat is called Shabbat Hagadol, the Big Shabbat. That's what it's called, the Big Shabbat, right? So every year at Shabbat Hagadol, we read the prophet Malachi. We read the very, 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 very end. And here's a little part of My Jewish Learning, great website that talks about who Malachi was, what he talks about. We're going to read about him. But what's really, really important, of course, is that he finishes with a reference to the prophet Elijah, right? He actually talks about Elijah. And so what's interesting about this, of course, is that, as we can see, the very last words of Malachi, which are also the very, very last words of the books of the prophets themselves, is this interesting line that says, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome and fearful day of God. Right? And we're actually going to see that phrase used today in our prophetic books. We've already seen it. Of course, we started seeing it in the prophet Joel and even Isaiah, or at least second, or parts of Isaiah use the word the awesome and fearful day of God, or this big day of God, or it shall happen on that day. And this is Bayom Bo Yom Adonai, or Yom, it'll say there'll be a day coming, translation, the day of the Lord. And he says the day of the Lord is a special visitation of Elijah, who will announce that, right? Because he's going to tell you, he's going to announce it. This is the first place where we have a connection between Elijah and the messianic redemption. This is the first time that this is articulated, that, well, it's not, it doesn't even say messianic redemption, that tied to that big day, Elijah is part of it, right? Elijah will be there. So we know that Elijah doesn't have a normal death. Let's put it that way. Some people say he didn't die. He got taken up in the book of Kings in a chariot of fire. And so the fact that Elijah comes back, we have so many legends about Elijah, but this is the first one. And the first one is his connection with the day of the Lord, right? And look at what Elijah does. I'm going to show you one other thing too. And again, when we come back to this, we'll read it a little bit more in detail in a few weeks, but I want you to see what we do, because this is one of the main uses of all the minor prophets, and definitely one of the most important uses of the prophets all year as we get ready for this big Shabbat, this great Shabbat. What does he do? He will reconcile children, parents with their children, and children with their parents, so that when I come, I do not strike the whole land with utter destruction. I will reconcile parents with children and children with parents, so that there isn't total destruction. And then traditionally, we don't end with that, because that's a pretty dark phrase, right? And so the tradition is to go back to the line before it and to end with that and to say it again. Hinei Anochi, I will send, look, I will send the prophet Elijah before you, right? So this is good news. So we reference this all the time, right? We talk about Elijah coming all the time. Passover is famous because we open the door and we do the whole routine with welcoming in Elijah, but I mean, we do it every Shabbat, right? Every weekend when we sing Eliyahu Hanavi at the end of Shabbat at Havdalah, we're singing the same song that we sing at Passover. But even more so, every time we eat food as part of the Birkat Hamazon, we talk about Eliyahu Hanavi. May he come speedily in our days, right? With good news, with good tidings. We say that as part of the Birkat Hamazon every time we eat. So Elijah is referred to and talked about all the time as a messenger of this day of coming to us with hopefully with the news that we want to hear. But notice too, what does he do? He turns the hearts of parents to children and children to parents, which tells us that families have to get along in order for us to survive, right? We have to have that. Otherwise, we can't survive. So what's so important, I always thought, was here we are with our Seder table where we bring generations together, right? And we basically realize that if we don't have families getting along, how can we possibly have peace in the world, right? So we have to have it. Otherwise, how are we going to get along with people on the other side of the world if we can't get along with our own family? So this is an important idea as essentially as we get into this time. Any questions? Any comments? As I said, we will read it when we get to the actual text from that, but we're going to see some of those themes today. But Elijah is referred to also. Again, these stories become really important in the Christian Bible as Elijah is, kind of an announcer of the Messianic era, and therefore, and we have a lot of. I'll show you one of the most famous references. We have so many references to of Elijah in the Talmud. I will show you one of the famous ones. There's the I'll just show you one that people are always asking Elijah when they come into contact with him, when's the Messiah coming? Right? Tomorrow, right? That's what he says, right? When's the Messiah coming? So here's a famous line or famous text. Hold it one second. Here's the famous line here. Finding one of the versions of it. Here's one of them. This was the one from Sanhedrin that a lot of people will refer to. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi found Elijah the prophet, who was standing at the entrance of the burial cave of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, right? Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said to him, "When will the Messiah come?" And Elijah said to him, "Go ask him." And Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi asked, Where is he? Where's he sitting? And Elijah said to him, "At the entrance to the city of Rome." Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi asked him, "And what is his identifying sign? By which means, right, will I recognize him?" And Elijah answered, "He sits among the poor who suffer from illness, and all of them untie their bandages and tie them at once. But the Messiah unties one bandage and ties one at a time. He says, perhaps I will be needed to serve to bring about the redemption. Therefore, I will never tie more than one bandage so that I will not be delayed." Now, that's a really interesting thing because, of course, it tells us that the Messiah is there binding bandages for the lepers. That's what he's doing. But he doesn't do a lot of them at once. He wants to be ready at a moment's notice to go and do his work. So first of all, he's here already, which is an interesting idea. And the other one is that he's binding bandages for the lepers because, of course, what are we called to do? Take care of the people who are most vulnerable, right? Now here we're going to get to the kicker, the punchline. Rabbi Yoshua went to the Messiah. He said to the Messiah, "Greetings to you, my rabbi, my teacher." The Messiah said to him, greetings to you, Rabbi Bar Levi. Rabbi Yoshua Levi said to him, when will the master come? Right? When will you come? And the Messiah said to him, today. Today. Sometime later, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi came to Elijah. And Elijah said to him, what did the Messiah say to you? You said to Elijah that the Messiah said, greetings, shalom to you, Bar Levi. Elijah said to him, he thereby guaranteed you that you and your father will enter the world to come. Well, that's good news that you're going to heaven. As he greeted with shalom, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi then said to Elijah, the Messiah lied to me as he said to me, I'm coming today, and he did not come. And Elijah said to him that this is what he said to you. He said to you, he will come today if you listen to his voice. That's the kicker, right? That's the kicker. So the Messiah will come when we're ready. When we're ready. So that is what we're waiting for. Maybe, again, we have to do part of the work ourselves. We have to get our families together. So this is what we think about every year at this time of year. So when we welcome Elijah to our tables, are we ready for him? You know, are we ready for him today? Because that was the concept of welcoming Elijah, was that we're not just talking about freedom today. We're not just talking about freedom in the past, but we're talking about a time when everyone will be free, when there really will be redemption for the world, which is the Messianic era. So what we're working at is not just the moment, not just looking back, but looking to the future. By the way, do you now understand why Christians celebrated Easter at Passover? Do you understand now why it was so important for them to have their Messiah come at Passover? Because Malachi is telling us that this is the time to expect it. Every time we open our doors for Elijah, we're expecting the Messiah to come in. We're hoping that this is going to be the time of the Messianic redemption. Every year at Passover, it's the season for redemption, not just for our ancestors, but our own redemption. So that is a thought before Passover from the prophets. But again, when we get to Malachi, talk more about why he's the last prophet and the prophets and what happened to prophecy. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that too. But for right now, let's just get ready for Passover and read Zephaniah, who we're on right now. It's a very short book. Well, it's 3 chapters. It's the length that the minor prophets really are, with a few exceptions. They're all about 3 or 4 chapters. So he's actually close to the mean, if you will. But what is the interesting thing here about Zephaniah is we actually know a little bit about him. Maybe more about him than we know almost every prophet, because look at this. Rosemary, why don't you read the first line? So interesting what we know about him.
The word of God that came to Zephaniah, son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah, during the reign of King Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah.
And again, this means he lived around 600 BCE, about 20 years before the destruction of the temple. We had a really, really good king, like one of the best, Josiah. He reformed the temple. He got rid of all the idols. He brought the priests into power to make sure that only God would be worshipped. And he made this great reformation. He made sure everyone celebrated Passover. According to tradition, he found either the Torah or he found the book of Deuteronomy and a scroll and had it read in front of everybody, and everybody tried to get on the right page, but it seems that it was too late. And not only that, as Josiah dies really, really soon after that, he gets killed in battle with the Egyptians. And he didn't live very long. so it's kind of ironic that this really good king, really again, almost without fault, but yet he dies. And maybe even accelerates the confrontation with the Babylonians, because the Babylonians are now at our door. But look, we not only know when he lived, but we know his family. Now, what's interesting about this introduction to him is this is a super long introduction of genealogy. I mean, this is 4 generations, perhaps. It says, son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah. Now, look, the commentary is that if he's the great-great-grandson or maybe great-grandson of Hezekiah, that means he's related to royalty. And that means that the genealogy was established so that we'd know that Zephaniah is part of the inner circle. He's a relative of Hezekiah, who, by the way, was a good king. He's one of the few good kings. He's the king that survived the Assyrian siege. He survived, and that was during the time of the prophet Isaiah, and he seemed to be a good king, one of the few good kings of the Davidic line, really outstanding king. So maybe he's related to that Hezekiah. We don't know for sure. We do know that this is unusual to see anyone besides someone's father being mentioned. Now, there's another interesting factor to this genealogy, which is that it says he's the son of Cushi. Now, Cushi is not usually a person's name. It's an ethnic identity. It's a national origin. And it's actually mentioned here in the book. So it's not like we have to go far to figure out or remind ourselves who the Cushites were, right? Who are they? Where's Cush?
Ethiopia.
Yeah, Ethiopia or Sudan. It's sub-Saharan Africa. It's where Africa starts to get dark. The skin starts to get dark. I'm serious. Because in Hebrew today, Cush or Cushi is a black person. It's usually used somewhat, I won't say it's pejorative, but it's not, look, you never even are sure what to say necessarily in America, whether you should say black or African American, but in Israel, Cushi is definitely used in a more slang sense of calling somebody by the African title that they were mentioned, or they were called in the Bible. I don't think it's necessarily always derogatory. I guess it sometimes, is the intent, but to call someone Cushi is not necessarily like always with the intention of saying it negatively. But again, do you have to point out someone's ethnicity anyways? But look, there are a lot of Africans, or there have been waves of African immigrants to Israel recently. Israel hasn't been happy with it because they've primarily been illegal immigrants who snuck over the border from Egypt, and they've dealt with some issues of homelessness and crime and some other stuff in Tel Aviv especially. And so Israel's had some issues with that over the last 15, 20 years. But generally speaking, and it's in the Bible, in the biblical time, there was no derogatory intent to call someone a Cushite. It was really just where they were from. And again, it's this area of Sudan and Ethiopia that was below Egypt. And is
Mark,
this telling? Yeah.
that's the use of Cushite, but doesn't Miriam mock Moses's wife for
Yes.
being dark?
Well, he says, and Judith is referencing the story in Numbers where Miriam seems to be talking about either Zipporah or another wife that Moses may have taken, because we never hear that Moses's wife Zipporah is a Cushite. It does say she's Midianite, and Midianites could have been dark, but the idea of making fun of her for not being, it could have been enough that she was an Israelite, that Miriam is pointing out. It doesn't necessarily mean that she's black and mocking her for being black. Of course, the irony is that Miriam, as punishment, has her skin color taken away. So it could be that God is teaching her a lesson. If her intent was racist, she becomes Snow White. We don't want to say leprosy because it wasn't leprosy, but Snow White skin disease she's hit with temporarily. But in the Bible, Cushite is not used that way. And we're going to see it in this book. We're going to actually see it referenced as an area. And again, originally the Bible simply calls Cush one of the descendants of Noah. He's one of the African descendants, but so is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, are also an African descendant, a Hamitic descendant. And of course, the Hamites in general are not regarded well by the book of Genesis, because that branch is cursed. But it doesn't seem like the Hamites are cursed because of being dark, but because Canaan was Hamitic, according to the book of Genesis. And Canaan is really the one who gets called out as a curse. Of course, we've talked about it. Because Ham is cursed, that justified in some people's minds slavery. Up until the 1860s in this country, people still reference that Bible quote from Genesis to allow for Black Africans to be slaves. So it wasn't irrelevant. It was not just a midrash. It wasn't just an interpretation. It was law in this country that you could keep an African as a slave, and it was justified to some extent by the text in the Bible from Genesis. So this is not irrelevant, and it's crushingly difficult to read that and know that that's the way some people interpreted the Bible. Judaism never interpreted the Bible that way. So nowhere in the Talmud, for example, does it say you can keep an African a slave because of what the Bible says in Genesis. On the other hand, you can keep other people slaves because the Bible and the Talmud allows for slavery, but not based on skin color. You could literally keep a Greek, an Egyptian, anybody a slave, technically, who is not an Israelite. You were supposed to let Israelites free from their servitude after 7 years. Other than that, there were slaves that you could keep as slaves, but it had nothing to do with skin color. So I do want to make that clear. The Cushites are not disregarded, or as a people, the Cushites are not looked down on in the Bible. So there are people who feel that Zephaniah was Black. So if you want to look up, here's an article from the Jewish Chronicle that says that maybe Zephaniah was a mixed race prophet, perhaps. That's from last year. So is it possible that he was? Yeah, it's possible. Because what happens is, if we understand Cushi not to be one of his ancestors, but to be his ethnicity, this makes a little bit more sense. If he's been Cushi, but then his father was Gedaliah, which is, by the way, a completely legitimate Hebrew name. We know about, of course, the governor Gedaliah, who was murdered by us, by the way, the Babylonian governor, Jewish governor that was established by the Babylonians. So Gedaliah would have been his father, not that same Gedaliah, but a Gedaliah. Amariah would have been his grandfather, and then Hezekiah would have been his great-grandfather, which actually from a time period makes a little bit more sense. It could still be Hezekiah's great-grand. I mean, just to again show you what we're talking about time-wise, again, here's Hezekiah, here's Josiah. Hezekiah was his great-grandfather. So if his great-grandfather was Hezekiah, and he's living, and Zephaniah is living during the time of Josiah, right? Then it actually makes sense. He's a contemporary of Josiah, and their great-grandfather was the same guy, which technically would make them very, very distant cousins, or not very distant cousins, I guess like would be third cousins. They'd be third cousins. He could have been Josiah's third cousin, but it definitely makes him part of the inner circle. And what that article, by the way, of talking about him being mixed race means is that on one side, and his mother's side, maybe he was Cushite, and on his father's side, he was a descendant of a king. And by the way, there's no reason to believe that wasn't the case, and it doesn't have to be called out at all, other than it says that he is a Cushite. So we don't know, but I will tell you it's possible. It's very possible. And that's not like I'm not trying to say that as, hey, let's have a woke midrash on this. I'm serious. It is possible that this is, that Ben Cushi is. It's also possible that Cushi was the name of his father and then Gedaliah was his grandfather. Those are both possibilities. The rabbinic interpretation of it is, there is rabbinic interpretation that he was Cushite. Okay, so, and again, it's partly because they're mentioned here in this book, in this very book. All right, so here's how Zephaniah begins. Remember, there's only 3 chapters.
I will sweep everything away from the face of the earth, declares God. I will sweep away human and animal. I will sweep away the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea. I will make the wicked stumble, and I will destroy humankind from the face of the earth, declares God.
So what he just described is a literal reversal of creation, right? I'm taking out everything and I'm going back from the way things were created. Humans and animals last, then birds of the sky, fish of the sea. So I'm starting over. I'm wiping out creation. Or not even I'm starting over. I'm just undoing creation. So this is a apocalyptic view, though notice, again, here it's undoing creation. It's undoing it. It's not so much, again, well, let's look. Let's look at what he says.
I will stretch out my arm against Judah and against all who dwell in Jerusalem, and I will wipe out from this place every vestige of Baal and the name of the priestlings along with the priests, and those who bow down on the roofs to the host of heaven, and those who bow down and swear to God, but also swear by Malcham, and those who have forsaken God, and those who have not sought God and have not made inquiry.
So you can see what's going on here, which is that people are still worshiping Baal. And so I got to destroy it because we're not getting rid of it on our own. The stuff that Josiah was doing, right? These Josianic reforms, as they're called, they didn't hit, they didn't take root because it's too deep. The Baal worship is too deep. And of course, people are bowing down to the constellations. They're worshiping the gods of the heavens. They're worshiping, as we already heard in Amos, they're worshiping the stars. They're worshiping these star gods. And what's also interesting is they're worshiping God in some cases, but they're also worshiping Malcham or Milcom, who was with God, one of the gods of the Ammonites worshipped, their main god. So Baal, Milcom, Chemosh, all these other gods that we read about, yeah, they're worshiping them in addition to God. So some people are covering all their bases. Maybe they're not worshiping Baal alone, but maybe they're worshiping God in Baal. Maybe they're worshiping God in Malcham. They're trying to do a little bit of everything. So this is not working. You can't get rid of it.
Be silent before my sovereign God, for the day of God is approaching. For God has prepared a sacrificial feast, has bidden the guests purify themselves. And on the day of God's sacrifice, I will punish the officials and the king's sons and all who don a foreign vestment. I will also punish on that day everyone who steps over the threshold, who fills their master's palace with lawlessness and fraud. In that day there shall be, declares God, a loud outcry from the fish gate, and howling from the Mishnah, and a sound of great anguish from the hills.
Yeah, so you can see an interesting way that he's going to look at this, which is this guy knows Jerusalem. He knows what's going on. He knows that God's, the temple, the holy areas, they're filled with idolatry, right? And he's going to go through the city of Jerusalem now, and he's going to hit all the quarters. Now, interestingly, Israel, since Jerusalem has been part of Israel, again, for these last 60 years, almost 57 years this year, a lot of these quarters, a lot of these areas are now called by their names now. We're going back and trying to put these biblical names back on the different quarters, the different areas of Jerusalem, rather than just refer to Jerusalem by their quarters, by the Jewish quarter, or Christian quarter, or Armenian quarter, going back to these areas that were mentioned in the biblical period. It's reminding us of Jerusalem during the biblical period.
The dwellers of the Machtesh howl, for all the traders have perished, all who weigh silver are wiped out. At that time, I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish all those who rest untroubled on their lees, who say to themselves, God will do nothing, good or bad. Their wealth shall be plundered, and their homes laid waste. They shall build houses and not dwell in them, plant vineyards and not drink their wine.
And of course, we looked at what the prophets have said before. That is the worst. To build a house and not be able to live in it, to plant a vineyard and not be able to grow the things there, to do all the work setting up for the future and then not being able to get it. It's very powerful prophetic poetry, right? It's not just, you're going to see your stuff get taken away. But this is much more powerful, much more poetic. And again, another line that kind of stays with us too is God will do nothing, good or bad. They're basically saying, what about the people who just say God doesn't really care? God's not going to do anything. It's not like they think, well, God's necessarily going to do anything good for us. Just God doesn't care. God's not there. God's not going to do anything. That's an interesting one, because it just shows you that they were kind of like, yeah, God doesn't seem to care. God's not going to do anything. So
the great day of God is approaching most swiftly. Hark, the day of God. It is bitter. There a warrior shrieks. That day shall be a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of calamity and desolation, a day of darkness and deep gloom, a day of densest clouds, a day of horn blasts and alarms against the fortified towns and the lofty corner towers. I will bring distress on the people, and they shall walk like the blind, because they sinned against God. Their blood shall be spilled like dust, and their fat like dung. Moreover, their silver and gold shall not avail to save them. On the day of God's wrath, in the fire of such passion, the whole land shall be consumed. For God will make a terrible end of all who dwell in the land.
So again, similar to some of the destructions that we heard about in Isaiah, going back to the beginning, or to Jeremiah, who had very graphic descriptions of what that would look like. But these are pretty bad. These are pretty descriptive, pretty bad descriptions of what is going to happen to Jerusalem, right? Day when you'll hear the shofar, truah, right? You're going to hear it. So you can see how the shofar was used to warn people, to remind people that they got to be careful. They got to get back in your house or get out, leave. So you can see all of these things that are going to happen to the people of Jerusalem. It's a scary day for the people of Jerusalem. And you really can see that he's focusing on, what it must have been like for, or what it ended up being like for the people of Jerusalem when you live in the city, when you live in a city and, this chaos that happens when you're in the city. I assume that you had other fears when you lived in the country, that, you had no protection, that you didn't have a lot of warning. That was not necessarily anyone blowing a shofar. You're kind of on your own. But this is also scary in a different way. This is a scare in the mob of people that are going to be running through the city when this happens. So, this is his vision of what happens in his hometown. So that's chapter 1. Now, chapter 2 is about Israel or Jerusalem too, about Judah, but it also is about some other places nearby, which tells us that it's not just Judah that's going to get affected by this. It's going to be the area around you. Let's read chapter 2.
Gather together, gather, O nation, without shame. Before the day the decree is born, the day flies by like chaff. Before of God's fierce anger overtakes you, before the day God's anger overtakes you. There's a word missing there.
Correct, right? So,
Is that in the Hebrew?
yeah, let me just see. Mary, what is yours? When it gets to before the day the decree is born, the day flies by like chaff. What does that say on your? And
Bring forth before the day pass, before the fierce anger of the Lord come upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger come upon you.
Yeah, and the reason, so it says just before the fierce anger of God overtakes you, before the day of God's anger overtakes you. So there's a structure here to the poem, right? Which is before, which is the translation of B'terem. So there's B'terem, B'terem, B'terem. So we know that there's 3 B'terems. We know that there's B'terem, and then it says blank, right? So where this line is here, there does seem to be a word missing, which is why they don't translate it. There is a word missing here. We don't know what it is. Because lo yavo alechem harun af Adonai. I mean, the understanding, of course, is that it's something of God's fierce anger. But there was something like a decree. There's something like that was there. So something like ladat chok, which is here, was here. We just don't know what it was. So there's a word that was, again, probably a scribal error because they just left off a line or again, if assuming it was like written in poetry, that there was a line that just scribe skipped over. So, but again, the idea is that God's angry with you and you're gonna, this is all hitting now. But okay.
So one scribe missed a line and it's gone? Like, we don't have other variations of it,
No, sometimes we do. But the main place we see that, of course, is going to be the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, unless you're working with a book that we have a really complete version of, like Isaiah, for example, right? We don't have, and they have lots of sections of Isaiah. We're not necessarily going to hit the missing word. So, yeah, I don't believe the Septuagint has it. So the scribal error was already there before 2,000 years ago, or 2,100 years ago. So we don't have it. Yeah. So look, we knew we had words missing from Samuel. We discussed this a long time ago, but we knew we had words, entire line missing in a couple cases from Samuel. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls and we found a really good copy of, in one of the caves of Samuel, we were like, oh, there's the missing line. So I mentioned this before. Samuel is one of the worst, or at least the beginning of Samuel in particular, is one of the worst scribal editions that we have. The scribe who wrote Samuel was lazy as hell. I don't know. He was drunk. I don't know. The guy whose book we have in the Masoretic text just was not good. And again, it was one or two scribes, because after they kept getting copied over, they were bad. I mean, there was nothing you could do. No one knew where the good copy was. But when we found the Dead Sea Scroll, we were like, oh, there's the good copy. And the Septuagint helped us a little bit, but the Qumran scrolls really helped us. So it was, it's good when we have that help. Again, does it radically change what this is? No, because we know what the context is. We 100%, we could guess, and even if we were wrong, we're not going to be that wrong, because we know from the context what he's talking about. God's angry with you. So the word that's missing there is, again, either something about the decree or something else that is going to have to deal with God's anger overtaking you. So it's not a tough one to figure out, but yeah. So generally speaking, the things that we're missing are not, they're not going to change our understanding of Jewish history. Let's put it that way. But it's good to know. I mean, it's always good to have those little things filled in for us. All right. Let's go.
Seek God, all you humble of the land who have fulfilled God's law. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will find shelter on the day of God's anger.
So again, this is the word by Yom Af Adonai. So here's Yom Af Adonai, Yom Af Adonai. I mean, we know this is God's day of anger, but maybe you'll survive God's anger, right? Maybe if you seek righteousness, if you seek humility, you'll survive when God's anger hits on that day, right? We talked about before. Now, here's the line I want you to see.
Indeed, Gaza shall be deserted and Ashkelon desolate. Ashdod's people shall be expelled in broad daylight, and Ekron shall be uprooted. Ah, nation of Kerethites who inhabit the seacoast, there is a word of God against you. O Canaan, land of the Philistines, I will lay you waste without inhabitants.
So it's not just the people of Judah that are going to get punished. Now, of course, what's interesting of this line is Ki Aza Azuva. Somebody must have quoted this in the last few weeks. Some rabbi quoted this somewhere. There's no way that didn't happen. There's no way. No way. Now, that being said, it's clearly the context of this that it's not about Gaza in particular, right? It mentions four of the five major Philistine cities. The only one that's not mentioned here is Gath, but all the other Philistine, we call the Pentapolis, the five cities of the Philistines are mentioned. I mean, the question of why Gath isn't mentioned here could be, again, maybe it wasn't that important during the time of of Zephaniah. Maybe Gaza and Gath were kind of linked together. I mean, who knows? But Ashkelon and Ashdod and Ekron are all part of Israel today. So the fact that the Philistine territory, the coastal territory, and Ekron, which is inland, the fact that these areas are now, for the most part of Israel is interesting because think about it. Ashkelon was also going to be desolate. Ashdod would also be expelled. Now, of course, during this last confrontation with Hamas, Ashkelon did get hit by lots of rockets, and there were people who got killed, and there were places that were damaged in Ashkelon, which is a nice town. I mean, Ashkelon is a city with, 50,000 people, 60,000 people. It's a pretty big coastal city. It's a nice city. There's a lot of South African and British Jews. It was kind of built as a garden city, and there was it's a nice town. It's a nice coastal area. It's maybe a little too close to Gaza for people's liking over the last 10, 15 years, but God willing, they won't have to worry about rockets anymore. But they used to get hit first by rockets. Ashkelon was the first area that got hit. Sometimes the rockets would get to Ashdod, which is closer to Tel Aviv. And of course, sometimes they get to Tel Aviv, but Ashkelon got hit a lot. Ashkelon was, 10 miles, 5 miles from, 10 miles from most of the bases in Gaza. And it was hit a lot. It was, it was where Shira was based. Shira was in Israel a couple of years ago for about a month and a half. She lived in Ashkelon when she was doing an exchange program there one summer. And I'll tell you, going to places and having friends that live in Ashkelon and seeing what happened to that city during this war really affected her, because she actually, was like, oh, that's a place that I went to, and it's now, that building has now been blown up. So it definitely affected her to have connections to that city. But Ashkelon was a Philistine city. It was not a city during the time of the temple where maybe very many Jews lived. It was inhabited by the Philistines. Ashdod as well. And Ashdod today is one of the main port cities. Ashdod and Haifa are the two main ports for Israel, commercial and tourist ports. There are a lot of cruises that come into Ashdod. When people visit Israel now on cruises, most of them stop in Ashdod, and they go from Ashdod to tour wherever they're going to go in Israel. A lot of times they go to Jerusalem for the day. People who've never been to Jerusalem before, they'll stop in Ashdod. It's an hour and a half by bus, but that's where they'll get off, and then they'll take them, whatever the stop was in Israel, they'll get off at Ashdod. People don't go to Ekron. It's not a city or an area where people go, though they have done some interesting excavations in Ekron. What's interesting about them is that they're called both Kerathite or Philistine and Canaan, right? Which is interesting because, again, these people are all lumped together. The Philistines and the Canaanites here are lumped together, partly, or at least maybe because in the mind of the Judeans, definitely it seems, well, I think you just saw it. In the mind of Zephaniah, these coastal peoples, they're not Jews, they're not Israelites, and he kind of lumps them together as people who are also going to be hit by this, and they live on the coast. So maybe again, by this point, Canaanites have been pretty much pushed to the coast, and Judah and Israel they're living in the land, the interior of the land, and they don't care so much that the Canaanites are living on the coast. That means that also up by Haifa, which was Phoenician and maybe more Canaanite, that's where they were. But it shows you that Israel and Judah didn't care so much about the coast. They didn't care as much about it. But again, the Cretim, Kerethites, you can hear, that's Crete. That's Crete. Because that's where the Philistines also had inhabited, and maybe that was their last stop before they came to our coast, or to the coast of Israel, right? They came from Crete, the Cretim. So that's the Philistines. But they're going to also be affected by this. They're going to be hit as well, the coastal communities. But again, it shows you in the mind of, in the ancient Israel, the coast was not our homeland. Ironically, today, it's where most of Israel is concentrated, on the coast, from Haifa down to Tel Aviv. That's where much of the population is. With the exception of Jerusalem and Beersheba, almost all the population of Israel is along the coast today. Not then.
The sea coast, Kerot, shall become an abode for shepherds and folds for flocks, and shall be a portion for the remnant of the house of Judah. On these pastures they shall graze their flocks. They shall lie down at eventide in the houses of Ashkelon, for the Eternal their God will take note of them and restore their fortunes.
Yep. So what's going to happen in the future? All those areas where the Canaanites and the Philistines lived, after this destruction, they're not coming back. They're going to be inhabited by us. These people that live down by the coast, our shepherds are going to live there. Which, of course, if you're a coastal person, you don't want shepherds living in your house or in your area. That's for people who fish. That's for people who understand the coast. Those are
Sheep
people
belong
who-
up in the hills anyway.
Exactly, but they'll be able to expand even into Ashkelon. Those areas where the Philistines used to keep us out, they're not going to keep us out. They're not going to be there. So those will be a place where we're going to graze our sheep. We're going to graze our sheep right to the coast, right to the water we're going to be, which again, it shows you how we saw ourselves. We saw ourselves as shepherds, the house of Judah. But of course, it's the people who survive, right? It's the Sharit. It's the Sharit Bet Yehuda. Sometimes it's the Sharit of Israel, but here it's Judah, right? But yeah, we're going to be all the way down by the coast. All right. So that's what happens to the Philistines. And by the way, that is what happened to the Philistines. The difference is that not long after this, though, we started getting waves of other people from the Aegean, specifically Greeks, and then, of course, later Romans, who inhabited the coast. Because the Greeks and Romans loved the coast too, and they were much more seafaring people, and quite frankly, it's not our thing. And so by the time of Alexander the Great and those Greek communities there, they were all not really under our control that much either. I mean, it's not like we weren't there. We know King Herod built this beautiful, beautiful palace and harbor at Caesarea, but for the most part, that was not our thing. That was not where we lived, and that's not where we saw ourselves as a people. We were living up in the Galilee then. We were living down in the south, but we were not sea people. And so even though he envisions that we're going to be pasturing our flocks there, if we did, it didn't go on for a very, very long time, because soon that area of Ashkelon and that area of Ashdod and those areas along the coast, Jaffa, those would be inhabited by Greeks and then Romans, who were much more into that than we were. So let's get to our other neighbors.
I have heard the insults of Moab and the jeers of the Ammonites, who have insulted my people and gloated over their country. Assuredly, as I live, declares God of hosts, the God of Israel, Moab shall become like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, clumps of weeds and patches of salt and desolation evermore. The remnant of my people shall plunder them. The remainder of my nation shall possess them. That is what they'll get for their haughtiness, for insulting and jeering at the people of God of hosts.
Yeah, so to the people on the east, right, to the Ammonites and Moabites, yeah, you guys thought you were going to get away, and you thought that while we were getting pummeled, that you were going to get away with stuff. No, your areas are going to get overrun too, and we're going to inhabit those places as well. We'll end up living there as well. We'll end up plundering and possessing those areas ourselves. So yeah, what's of course interesting about this little diatribe, right? You remember Moab and Ammon were created because of Sodom and Gomorrah. Going back to Genesis, right? It was only after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that Lot's daughters went up into the mountains and of course had relations with their father and bore children to them, the Ammonites, Ammon and Moab. And those were their ancestors. So ironically, Moab and Ammon are now going to be like Sodom and Gomorrah, where your ancestor, Lot's wife, don't know her name, she's just Lot's wife, that's where she came from. So the irony is you're going to be like those people. And of course, you're going to be salt, like your ancestor who became a pillar of salt. And that's what you get for making fun of us.
God will appear terrible against them, causing all the gods on earth to shrivel, and all the coastlands of the nations shall bow in homage, every one in their own home.
Wow. So that's an interesting line right there. We're not exactly sure how to translate that, but that's the translation of Elohei Haaretz, the gods of the earth. Right? And it says that all the coastlands, right, all the islands and all the people way out there, they're all going to bow in homage.
You Cushites too, they shall be slain by my sword. God will reach out against the north and destroy Assyria, making Nineveh a desolation, arid as the desert. In it, flocks shall lie down, every species of beast, while jackdaws and owls roost on its capitals. The great owl hoots in the window, and the raven croaks on the threshold, for its cedar work is laid bare.
So on all sides, radiating further out, all the way up to Syria, to Nineveh, all the way down south, all the way down south to Cush. And there again, we had this reference to Cush. It's right there. So everywhere is going to be attacked. Doesn't matter. North, south, everywhere. It's going to radiate even further out, miles away from Israel. This is also going to be. And again, the imagery of what happens when these areas become ghost towns is amazing, right? That these owls hooting in the ruins of the city. It's a pretty the ravens cawing in the doors, right? That's a pretty graphic and pretty powerful poem. Yeah. Right.
Is this the exultant city that dwelt secure, that thought in her heart, I am, and there is none but me? Alas, she is become a waste, a lair of wild beasts. Everyone who passes by her hisses and makes a hand gesture.
So we've had that phrase before. You can see Jeremiah refers to, we just heard it last week, this hiss that people would make when they would see something horrible. Ugh. And maybe they went like this, like this smells here, or get this away from me. I don't want, we still do that. We go, ooh, make a little hand gesture of getting it away from us, or not wanting it near us, or scaring us a little bit. But yeah.
Hey, Rabbi,
Yeah.
is there any possibility that Nineveh is Gaza and Gaza is Nineveh?
Why?
I just want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, what they did is they went closer, and then they went to their nearby neighbors, and then they went out to their other neighbors, and they went out. The irony, of course, here is the Babylonians. So we've talked about this before. The Babylonians are kind of doing God's work, right? Because the Babylonians are first of all, it took out the Ninevites, who were not good. The Babylonians seem to have, at least according to Jeremiah, if we had just sat back and let them do what they were going to do, behaved, we would have been fine. But we had to keep making problems, going down to the Egyptians and trying to ally with the Egyptians and try to get rid of the Babylon. Like, we should have just taken our lumps and just dealt with it. And of course, there's this weird admiration of the Babylonians, and at the same time fear of them, and at the same time hatred of them, but also at the same time they're doing God's work. God was fed up, and God's only letting them do this because we've gone above and beyond deserving it, right? So let's let it happen. And even here, Zephaniah, he's saying, we got to clear it out. The only way to get rid of all these idols is for somebody to come in and burn it all up. And so that's the weird thing that we have in the prophets is this, well, they're just doing that. And again, all the prophets we've read up until now are up to the Babylonian and right after the Babylonian exile. So this is all what this is about. The next prophets we read, there's a different attitude there. But there is this kind of feeling, and we have it even in the rabbinic text, in the Midrash, and in the rabbinic text, which is that, like, Nebuchadnezzar is working for God. And so he's doing God's work. Let's hope he does it with the least amount of cruelty as possible, but he's doing God's work. I think there was also recognition that the Babylonians they saved some people. I don't know. Look, the problem is the Assyrians didn't conquer us. They conquered the north, and they tortured and killed a lot of people in Judah. And there's no good side of the Assyrians. The Assyrians are bad. There's nothing good about the Assyrians, about Nineveh. They're bad. Babylonians, it's a little bit more complicated, because if they're just doing God's work, then how can we really hold them fully responsible? And even more so, we made it worse for ourselves by not just sitting back and just saying, okay, they're the ones in charge now. Because we didn't do that to some extent, we kind of deserve the fate that we have. So there is a little bit of that. But remember, we're writing it by our ancestors wrote that. Our ancestors were not the people who got exiled by the Assyrians. We're the ones who got exiled by the Babylonians. And so, they were our reality. So I do think that affects our take on this. And so there is nothing good about Nineveh, nothing good about those people. And I think that, not that Babylonians are good, but there is this kind of understanding that, like, they're the ones in charge. God must have made them in charge. And so it's part of God's plan. And that definitely seems to be the idea that Jeremiah has. And it seems to be the idea that some of the other prophets have too, which is that this was just a necessary situation. We just have to deal with it. But again, is that because this is our reality and they're trying to make sense of it? Or did they really feel the Babylonians were better than the Assyrians when it came to the way they got treated. I don't know. So it is what it is. This is what we have. And yeah, it's not it's not a good situation, but it is the situation now. And as we get into chapter 3, it gives us the ability to have a fresh start. Doesn't start, it's not like chapter 3 just begins, hey, it's all good now. It's continuation, but we will get to the good stuff, I guess. The good stuff is coming.
Ugh, silent, polluted, overbearing city. She heeds no call, has learned no lesson. She has not trusted in God, has not drawn near to her God. The officials within her are roaring lions. Her judges are wolves of the steppe. They leave no bone until morning. Her prophets are reckless, totally faithless. Her priests profane what is holy. They give perverse rulings. But God in her midst is righteous and does no wrong.
Sorry, it just flipped. Yeah.
God issues judgment every morning as unfailing as the light. The wrongdoer knows no shame. I wiped out nations. Their corner towers are desolate. I turned their thoroughfares into ruins with none passing by. Their towns lie waste with nobody around, without inhabitants. And I thought that she would fear me, would learn a lesson, and that the punishment I brought on them would not be lost on her. Instead, all the more eagerly they have practiced corruption in all their deeds.
Yeah. And so you saw what happened to the northern kingdom. You've seen what's happened as the Babylonians have made their way through and have already taken some of the country. These are warnings. These are signs for you to turn back and to stop behaving like this. But instead, you've gotten worse. Because, of course, what happens in a lot of these cases? People behave worse. What do? They become more corrupt. When they get aid, they decide to sell it on the black market rather than give it to people. Yeah. It becomes even worse. And we're watching it happen right in front of us. If you want a demonstration of what happens when people are dealing with war and are dealing with feeling like they are, again, in desperate situations, they very rarely behave better. It's sad. We'd like to see people all of a sudden get the message, but it doesn't happen. So if you want a lesson, John, from today, this might be the one to take away. But it's not one that we necessarily need to hear, but the people who are dealing with destruction in their own area right now need to hear.
Do you mean how we behave in adverse situations?
No, how the people of Gaza are behaving right now as they're trying to figure out how to get aid to their people, right? And so, of course, as aid gets to them, it's not getting to the people necessarily who need it the most, it's getting to the people who have the most money. So,
Okay, that's a deeper discussion. That wouldn't be happening, but it's a but-for situation.
yeah, but if we want to know what our lives were like as the Babylonians were encircling our country and as we were starving, at least according to Jeremiah and all the prophets who lived during that time, including this guy, Zephaniah, we weren't behaving better. It wasn't like we got the message and said, you know what, God's trying to teach us a lesson here. Maybe we can fix this before we have to go through the final destruction. Look, Jeremiah was there telling people it doesn't actually matter because you're going to be destroyed. But at the same time, that doesn't mean, well, let's just act like let's act like animals.
Right.
But they were.
But wait for me, says
Oh, wait,
God.
wait, wait. So this is all bad, right?
Mhm.
This is up till this line. So this is line 7. This is not good. This is that it's happening and you're behaving bad. Now here's where it changes.
But wait for me, says God, for the day when I arise as an accuser, when I decide to gather nations, to bring kingdoms together, to pour out my indignation on them, all my blazing anger. Indeed, by the fire of my passion, all the earth shall be consumed. For then I will make the peoples pure of speech, so that they all invoke God by name and render service with one accord.
Which means that other nations are going to start worshiping me too.
From beyond the rivers of Cush, my suppliants shall bring offerings to me in fair Putzai. In that day, you will no longer be shamed for all the deeds by which you have defied me. For then I will remove the proud and exultant within you, and you will be haughty no more on my sacred mount.
So assumedly, and by the way, here it is again, Cush. Right? And we're not sure what Putzai is. Again, there's a possibility that maybe it's supposed to be Zion, but somehow this is not, that's wrong. It should be Bat Sion. But it seems like maybe it's a place within Cush, maybe in that area. But again, by Yom Hahu, on that day, right? You will eventually, not just you, but all these other people will come up to the Har HaKodesh, right? A sacred mount. There, it's right there. Bahar Kodeshi, my holy mount, right? Sacred mountain.
But I will leave within you a poor, humble folk, and they shall find refuge in the name of God. The remnant of Israel shall do no wrong and speak no falsehood. A deceitful tongue shall not be in their mouths. Only such as these shall graze and lie down with none to trouble them.
So again, this is a remnant of Israel. Sharit Yisrael. So talk about a remnant of Israel, right?
Shout for joy, fair Zion. Cry aloud, O Israel. Rejoice and be glad with all your heart, fair Jerusalem. God has annulled the judgment against you and swept away your foes. Israel's sovereign God is within you. You need fear misfortune no more. In that day, this shall be said to Jerusalem: have no fear, O Zion. Let not your hands droop. Your God, the Eternal One, is in your midst, a warrior who brings triumph, who will rejoice over you and be glad, who will shout over you with jubilation, who will lovingly soothe those long disconsolate. I will take away from you the woe over which you endured mockery.
Yeah. So this is the good days to come.
At that time, I will make an end of all who afflicted you, and I will rescue the lame sheep and gather the strayed, and I will exchange their disgrace for fame and renown in all the earth. At that time, I will gather you, and at that time I will bring you home, for I will make you renowned and famous among all the peoples on earth, when I restore your fortunes before their very eyes, said God.
So that is the vision of what happens for the people who will be the remnant, right? The people who survive will be able to come home and you will be renowned and famous. Everyone will be talking about you. So that's an interesting line. It's also, to some extent, has come true in a very weird way. How much time do they take talking about us on the news? How much energy is given to Israel by our networks and by people around the world who pay attention to a tiny little country of 8 million people? country that's smaller population than LA County. So, yeah, it's pretty wild. So it ends on a happy note. The whole chapter isn't happy, right? But you know, the last half of it is what we see in a lot of the prophets, which is there will be a time. And again, the phrase over and over again in here is bayom hahu or ba'ed hahi, in that moment, in that time, or in that day. But we had that phrase over and over again in this text, bayom hahu, right? So this is something that we hear in the prophets, but especially by percentage or by length of the book, which is a very short book. Bayom Hahu figures a lot in this book. It's over and over again in this book, Bayom Hahu. So that is definitely so it's hard as we read this, and as we see some of the words and some of the language and the message, it's hard not to see ourselves in this Mary, how does King James translate line 4? The prophets are reckless is the way it translates it here. Yeah. Yeah. So the phrase there is, again, the priests are profane what's holy. Hilul Kodesh, Hilul Hashem, or Hilul Kodesh is making these things, do this. But look at the last words, right? Which translates here as perverse. It's not really a great translation, right? The translation the King James had violent. They do violence to the Torah, or they give violent Torah. Right? That's the phrase. Hamas Torah. Hamsu Torah. So that is conflating or using two words that we're thinking about a lot right now. We're thinking about Torah because we're reading it, but we're also thinking about Hamas right now because they're doing violence. So here is Hamsu Torah doing violence to the Torah, or giving violent Torah. The priests profane what's holy, and they do Hamas to the Torah. However you want to translate that. Perverse or violent Torah. So that's an interesting phrase for today. So again, God is going to hold all nations into account. And when that happens, this is also going to bring this together. But you can understand why people at the end of World War II said, that's exactly what happened. All my blazing anger, right? Indeed, by the fire of my passion, all the earth shall be consumed, right? Bringing nations together. And it was after that, right? I'll bring these people together, right? I'll bring people, and I'll bring them, and they'll be able to come back, right? So that is that was the hope. I will gather together those people. So, and their disgrace will be translated into fame and renown, which is also, to some extent, what happened after the Holocaust. At least people in Israel today who see the legend and myth of Israel was turning a country that was born out of the Holocaust, born out of the degradation of turning Jews into dust, into ash, into skeletons if they were lucky to survive, and turning that into a country that is going to be a world leader in technology and health, in helping to bring desalinization and life to the rest of the world. Very hard for people in Israel not to see what they're doing as fulfilling this biblical prophecy, this idea, whether they're religious or not. It's hard not to look at that and say, this is what the goal of the country was from a biblical standpoint. So, as we finish that book, we're going to move into the next book. Again, finishing this book of Zephaniah. We're going to read this very short book of Haggai, which is only 2 chapters. Very small. But we just skipped 150 years into the future. Well, it's still our ancient past. It's still 2,400 years ago, but we just skipped into that time. In ahead to the time during the reconstruction of the temple. The people had waited in exile for 70 years, for a generation or two, right? Maybe there were some older people who were in their 90s, 80s or 90s, who remembered what the first temple looked like. But most of the people had never seen that temple. And now, what happens? According to this book,
In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, this word of God came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest.
yeah, and these 2 guys are very, very important. We read about them in the book of Ezra, Nehemiah. These are 2 really, really important dudes. One of them is Zerubbabel, who is a descendant of King David. He is a governor. He's a political leader. And there's a guy named Joshua, who is a priest. So we have a political leader and we have a religious leader. And those are the people who are charged with the reconstruction of Jerusalem, of Judah, of that area. And it's during the time of King Darius, who was the Persian king. A Persian king and a Persian dynasty that helps us. After they destroy the Babylonians, they help us come back. One of the things they did to the Babylonians after they destroyed them is they said to the people that had been destroyed by the Babylonians, we're not the same people. We're different. We're going to let you guys go back home. If you want, you can stay where you are, but you also can go back home. See how nice we are? Now you got to follow our rules when you go back home. You got to behave yourselves. You got to remember that you're paying taxes to us. You're part of our kingdom. You're part of our empire. But you go back home, you behave yourself, and everything's going to be great. And so the Persians, ironically, modern day Iran, were our saviors. The irony of that is not lost on us today when they are our biggest enemy. The people that we're allied with right now, the Arabs, they hate the Persians as well. So they hate Iran, but they are our allies on that because we have a common enemy. Make no mistake about it, though. Historically, Iran was a bigger friend than enemy. So that is where we are today. We hope that doesn't always stay that way, right? When Iran will have, and they will have it, they will have a revolution and the current religious leadership will be deposed. When that happens, and when Israel and Iran can have relationships again, it'll be very interesting to see what the Arabs do then. Will the Arabs still be our friends? Well, I don't know that they're exactly our friends now, but will that Abraham Accord stuff continue to work? We hope so. We'd like to be friends with everybody. But will there be a jockeying of position between Saudi Arabia, for example, and Iran with Israel once Iran is no longer a religious theocracy bent on the destruction of Israel? We know this. It won't be a good day for the Palestinians, because the Palestinians are used by both Iran and Saudi Arabia as ways of messing around with Israel. Though, again, it seems like Saudi Arabia has decided that they no longer want to be our enemy and would rather cooperate with us. But again, is that based on a calculation of Iran? We don't know. That is what we don't know. But we do know that over history, the Persians were usually a better ally for us than the other peoples around. So we'll see what happens. It'll be interesting to think. By the way, one of the reasons is that the Persians, most of the people that live in Iran, well, some are Iranian and some are Persian, but I don't want to get into the difference right now. But what's interesting, of course, is that both of us, Jews and Persians, are both not Arab, and yet we're surrounded by Arabs in those areas. So we have a natural connection in that we're two. In addition to that would be the Turks. Those three people are the only non-Arab people in the Middle East, really, of significance. I mean, there's also Coptic Christians. There's a decent amount of Armenians. There's some other groups. There's Kurds who are also not Arab. But there's very few people in the Middle East that are not Arab. But we are. All those groups that I just mentioned are non-Arab. So it's interesting to think, is there also perhaps one day going to be an alliance of Turkey, Iran, and Israel?
But I thought genetically we were close to the Arabs.
Genetically, we're very close to the Arabs. That doesn't matter. Yes, genetically, French and British people or French and Germans are very close. It didn't mean they got along. French and German killed each other for 1,000 years on the European continent. There was not a lot of difference. Franks lived in Germany and lived in France, and there was a common Frankish origin. It didn't stop these people from killing each other. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just telling you, the possibility that I just threw out that one day there's going to be a Turkish, Israeli, Persian alliance is far more probable than another possibility. Could be that the shift would be Jewish or Israeli and Arab alliance against Persian and Iran and Persian and Turkish alliance. We don't know, but all those things are possibilities. It's also a possibility that everyone just gets along. That's not I'm not betting on that one. I'm not betting on that one anytime soon. I'd love to say that all these peoples will all get along and they'll all find a reason to have commonality and a common allegiance to each other, which it's happened in Europe to some extent. Maybe it'll happen one day in the Middle East.
Maybe they'll just all hate America and then we'll be okay.
Anything's possible, folks, but the possibility of non-Arab alliance is also very, very possible. It doesn't seem possible today, but that doesn't mean it's not possible 20 or 50 years from now. Just remember
don't
that.
we right now, Israel, have an alliance with Saudi Arabia because they actually help?
We do.
Again?
We do. But right now that alliance or that well, we don't have Saudi Arabia is behind the scenes. It's with the United Arab Emirates and it's with Bahrain and it's with the other Persian Gulf countries. But all of that's based on the factor of Iran. So if Iran is no longer our enemy, if they're our friend, what happens to that alliance then? Because that's based on, again, the mutual distrust of the Arabs and Persians.
The Saudis don't like the Iranians then?
No.
Oh, I didn't know that.
No.
That really surprised me over the weekend.
No. They don't like each other at all. There's just a natural
regional rivals.
But there's also understand that the Iran-Iraq war that we lived through during the 80s into the 90s, that war was a war based on long-seated, long ago hatreds between Persians and Arab peoples. And it goes and it transcends religion, folks, because they're all Muslim. But the ethnic distrust and the dislike between those two groups is significant. And it's not, to some extent, it's been swept under the rug because of their mutual hatred of Israel. But as that has been diminishing, right, as that goes away, at least on the side of the Arabs, it's created an interesting dynamic. The dynamic will change again when Iran is no longer run by religious lunatics who would go back to the relationship that Israel had with the Shah. When Israel was in the early days of its country, it got its oil from Iran because the Shah loved Israel. The Shah had his secret service, which was fairly brutal, trained by Israel. He looked at the Israelis as the ultimate fighters against the Arabs. And he liked it. It did not make for, again, good relationships with the Arabs at that time, but we didn't care. Iran was our friend from the 40s to the late 70s for first 30 years of Israel's life. The only country in the Middle East that it had relationships with, besides Turkey, was Iran. And again, there was a reason for it. They're non-Arab. So that is a interesting thing to see what will happen there in the future. Will the Persians and the Jews once again cooperate? I know a lot of Persians who are looking forward to that day. The Persians who hate the government.
So if that
of Iran.
happened, Rabbi, are you saying that all of a sudden the Arabs would be Israel's enemy again?
I don't know that they'll shift back immediately. I'd hope not. Look, maybe Israel could be part of the relationship builder between those countries. But I'm telling you, that's not as likely as the Abraham Accord relationships would suffer if Iran suddenly became our best friend. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I will tell you one thing. Saudi Arabia would not like the idea of both a currently nuclear weaponized Israel with a country like Iran, which is so close to nuclear weapons that it can taste it. To have those two countries cooperating, and they're a country that does not have nuclear weapons. I think Saudi Arabia has nuclear weapons. The moment that Israel and Iran have a relationship, Saudi Arabia does everything they can to get a nuclear weapon, just so you know. So I think if maybe won't end the approachment that that Israel's had with the Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf countries, but it's not going to be a party for Saudi Arabia. They're hoping that doesn't happen. They're not looking forward to that happening, folks, because they know how advanced Iran is in most other ways. By the way, Iran has much. They're as soon as that government falls, they'll have women leading the government. There might even be a woman prime minister of Iran within a generation. I don't know when that's going to happen in an Arab country. Are you kidding me? I don't. Women run businesses in Iran. It's a totally different situation. So just so you know, mark my words. I hope it happens soon. But when that happens, you're going to have a lot of stuff going down. But let's see. We're going to read a little bit of. You know what? Actually, let's not get into Haggai now, and I'll tell you why. Because Haggai goes much better with the guys that we're going to read next week. So next week, just to show you again, and we will have class next week, even though it's running right through. It's the beginning of Passover, right? But I think it's a great time to look at these prophets. So as we said, Haggai, 2 chapters, right? Haggai is 2 chapters. Then we go to Zechariah, very long, right? 14 chapters. And then we go into the last of those prophets that we already took a look at today, Malachi, who's three chapters. So if we look at these last prophets in the prophetic books, we have 2, 14, and 3. So you can see we've got about 20 chapters to go in the prophets. That means we've got about 3 weeks that we'll be reading prophets, and most of it, as you can see, will be the prophet Zephaniah. The prophet Zephaniah, you can see, is he lives during this time too of Darius the Great, and we're going to take a look at him over a couple of weeks. He's one of the, well, he is the longest of the minor prophets. Again, the other really long, or not really long, but the other longer prophet we had was Hosea. And those two are by far the longest books in the prophets. And for the most part, again, if we pull those two out, most of the other ones are 3 or 4 chapters. So it's almost, again, totally skews against what the minor prophets are, which are 3 or 4 chapter books. And so we'll read 2 of them, Haggai and Malachi and Zechariah. But these 3 guys are all contemporaries. These 3 guys all worked during the Second Temple and are kind of giving us a vision of what the world should look like now that we're rebuilding. So to use a modern equivalent, again, these guys lived before the restoration of Israel. These guys lived during the restoration of Israel, and are hoping that people do a better job of running the country than their ancestors did, and not making the same mistakes this time around. So you can understand why this. Again, this is a good time to break. We'll, as I said, we'll pick these guys up next week. We'll probably read the beginning of Haggai and then into the first 4 or so 5 chapters of Zechariah, and then probably another week of Zechariah, and then the last week will be Malachi. The end of Zechariah and the beginning of Malachi. So any questions, any comments? Again, next week when we're here, we'll have class tomorrow night too for Pirkei Avot. We're actually finishing up Pirkei Avot tomorrow. And then we'll be moving into our next thing Wednesday, which I will announce tomorrow night what we're gonna be doing. And then again, within the next few weeks, we're also going to be making this transition out of the prophets into the books of the writings. And specifically, again, we'll be able to spend probably a couple months reading the Psalms, which the Psalms we could read for a year, and not only read, but listen to. So it's really great when we get into Psalms, because we not only read them, but as we have in past years, and it's been a few years, we'll get to listen to some Psalms. And what's so nice is that there are new Psalms, there are new Psalm versions that have come out since the last time we read the Psalms, including, by the way, even though they're not exactly the Psalms, some of you might have seen that this dude wrote some Psalms. Don't know if you know that. Good. This guy, Paul Simon, just did a little composition. There's a movie, a documentary they just did about this, but this is the 7 Psalms. You can start listening or getting into 7 Psalms in time for us to read Psalms. So yeah, it's interesting. He's been doing giving some interviews and talking about how these songs came to him, which kind of describes it in a pretty prophetic way. The songs kind of came to him in the subconscious, in the dream, and if you will, he channeled them. And as a lot of musicians have said, when they talk about music that moves them, oftentimes they say they just channeled it. They don't know where it came from. They just kind of they were channeling it. So, all right, folks, Hag Sameach, have a great Pesach if we don't see you. And again, hopefully you'll join us for the second night if you can. If you still want to join us, please make sure you sign up. But otherwise, we'll see you in the coming days. And of course, we'll be here Friday night. We have Friday night services with Wendy.
I
this
just
Friday.
want to mention that this week is David's yard site, and I wanted to dedicate today's study.
And let's dedicate that and lots of good deeds in honor of David. Thank you, Rosemary. And thank you so much for reading for us today and
Thank you.
getting us into the shape of Passover and into the mode of Pesach together. And again, let's have a great Pesach. And again, thank you for reading and dedicating this in honor of David, who is a wonderful soul, wonderful spirit, and we're still inspired and guided by him. So thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you.
And
See you
Rabbi,
soon, Mary.
Mendocino Farms.
Oh, thank you. Mendocino Farms too. On a lighter note, Mendocino Farms 2 days from now on Thursday night. See you then.
Thank
Or I
you.
won't see you.
See ya.
Grab a sandwich. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
Take care.
everybody.